Hi everybody and welcome back to Clear Tuition. You're probably in your second week of text analysis this week. And as you're in your second week, we're probably progressing our reading of the play in class. You may have even begun to annotate your own copy of the text with your navigation along the top of the book to allow you to move easily between acts and scenes. And you may have begun to use page tabs or your own highlighting and note-taking processes to identify the ways in which themes are developing or characters are changing as your reading progresses. And I really hope that at this stage, you've begun to get your head around what this is a story about, why it is that Shakespeare may have written it, and what we should get out of it as readers. So by the end of this week, the hope would be that most of us have finished reading the text for at least the first time, and that we can begin to engage in deeper analysis of the characters specifically. So my job this week then is to provide you with 3 tutorials to specifically support your understanding of the stylistic devices that you are most likely to be asked to analyse in your response in the external assessment. And those are characterisation, themes, and symbolism or motifs. So why am I referring to them as stylistic devices this week when last week they were part of the anatomy of a play? And one of the key differences, of course, is that when we were referring to the anatomy of the play last week, we were literally talking about the organisation of words on that page. And if we were reading simply for entertainment, that might be all we need to know to navigate through that text. However, because we're reading as analysts, we need to name those components, so characterisation, themes and symbolism and motifs, as stylistic devices. And those are devices, so tools of the style, so tools of a play, used by the author to make meaning. Okay, so we are deliberately recognizing that Shakespeare has manipulated characterization, has manipulated the way in which a theme is developed or who is involved in developing a theme, so that by the end of the reading of it, we understand something, we've learned something. So the first of our tutorials this week is focused on characterization. And before I start the tutorial, I'd like to highlight that over the last few lessons, tutorials from last week, I introduced some terminology to you, terminology associated with the discussion of context or the construction of a text. And I've put all that together into a PowerPoint and I will attach it to our Padlet. So it's part of our roadmap to the external assessment, things that you've got to get control of. And I've added to it the terminology associated with this week's lessons. And I will continue to add to it. So it will be a live document. And as we move out of just our comprehension and understanding of the play and into preparation for writing, then the focus of the terminology will actually be on essay production rather than the reading of a play. So let's have a look at that PowerPoint and then add to it for our understanding of characterization. Okay, so here is the, jump back. Here is the PowerPoint I'm talking about. So I will add it to the Padlet. I'll name it exactly the same thing, preparation for external assessment, vocab for analytical writing. You'll see that it already includes the terminology from last week. So this is our terminology associated with with context. And certainly you can do some of your own research there as well. They're the terms that we've got to be really comfortable with using. This is the terminology associated with the anatomy of a play, so text structures. And while there's not very many on the page and while they're not particularly new to you, we will see all of those terms again, and we will unpack in much more detail the relevance of each of them and how we actually use them to support our argumentation. And here is our language for today. So we're focusing on the language of character analysis. Now, the point I want to make, when we were writing our own narratives, we probably worked with the idea of the creation of a character. And as a result, it became something that our character was sort of this entity that existed without us. Like it wasn't necessarily that we even created them. And I want you to understand that that's not normally the case. You did create your characters and you probably created them in that form for a purpose. And the purpose behind the creation of characters becomes more clear the longer that you've been writing. And so when we look at Shakespeare's writing, there is quite deliberate meaning behind the construction of the characters in the way they appear. So as we mentioned, the representation of kings in Macbeth is designed specifically to legitimize James I on the throne. So we present a king who claims to be, we don't present it. We have seen a king, James I, who claimed to be descended from Banquo. So naturally, if we're going to get the king on side, Banquo needs to be the good guy. So Banquo receives a prophecy that he does not act on. And if we really want to create a character that everyone will see as a good guy, what better way than to create a great villain to sit in opposition to them? And so we see also the creation of a king who is everything that James I is not. Okay, so Macbeth shows that he is not James I. He is not a good king by consorting with witches, by being prepared to commit regicide and kill the king, by trying to kill James I's own ancestor, Banquo, and by ultimately turning on his own people. So none of those actions are ideal for a king. And in creating a character who is villainous in nature, we actually contrast with we created a character who was villainous in nature. We killed him at the end of the story. And the message to audiences, of course, is to not behave in that way. So the deliberate choices made by Shakespeare help to characterize evil, help to characterize immorality. And the lesson for us as a reader is to not follow Macbeth's example and to instead be something like Banquo or something like Macduff or something like Duncan. Okay, so let's have a look at the language associated with characterization. So the first two there you've probably seen before. A protagonist is the main character of a story, and the protagonist makes key decisions that affect the plot. Now, that's a really great way to think about that, rather than the protagonist is the good guy. The protagonist makes key decisions that affect the plot, okay? Primarily influencing the story and propelling it forward. And that's, when we consider it in that regard, there are lots, we can certainly say that Macbeth is a protagonist. We might not actually be able to say that Hamlet is the protagonist of his own story, because he doesn't actually make a lot of key decisions. That's the whole problem. In contrast, or sitting in opposition, is an antagonist. And this definition is a little limited, and I'll explain why. An antagonist is a character in a story who's presented as the chief foe. Now, an antagonist doesn't actually have to be a foe, like an enemy. An antagonist simply has to complicate the decision-making process for the main character, for the protagonist. And so that means that an antagonist doesn't even have to be human. It doesn't even have to be a living thing. It could be a storm. It could be fear. And it's enough that the presence of that thing or that entity stops the protagonist from being able to achieve their rightful end, okay? And so the protagonist has to work to get past the interference of the antagonist in order to fulfill their own story. Now, the reason I'm drawing your attention to that, because I've also included then underneath it the idea of a villain. So this is someone with evil intent or immoral intent or selfish intent, who is directly responsible for tragic harm and danger. So let's look at those together. A protagonist is the main character of the story who makes decisions that affect the plot and propel the story forward. But a villain acts with evil intent or selfish intent and makes decisions that are responsible for direct danger or harm. So what we've actually got in Macbeth is a villain protagonist, and they're fairly rare because it's hard to engage with a character who is both the main character and bad. But as is so often the case in Shakespeare's stories, it is not a case that that characters are ever presented as wholly good or wholly bad. And that is because people aren't wholly good or wholly bad, and we recognize something of ourselves in each of the characters. Okay, so those three terms you were probably familiar with. And if we've cast Macbeth as a villain protagonist, then we have to think who ultimately complicates his story enough to be considered an antagonist. There are probably a couple of people who actually fulfill that role, and being able to articulate who you think the antagonist is and why is part of your analytical process. Now, the next two terms are terms that may very well be new to you, but they're really important for studying Shakespeare, and they're really important for studying specifically this play Macbeth, because we need to recognise why it is that characters end up the way they end up. So the first one is hamartia. So hamartia is the fatal flaw, a personal trait that leads a tragic hero to their downfall, to their demise. So remember that the whole definition of a tragedy was, a story where the actions of the protagonist lead to his own downfall. Okay, so it sort of comes full circle. So when we think about someone like Macbeth, we might be able to identify more than one fatal flaw. And it's really important to be able to note that there's more than one and be able to articulate how it is that those fatal flaws work together. And I mentioned to you in our introduction to the language of tragedy last week that it's possible to be ambitious, but for it not to be a flaw. It's possible to be trusting and for that not to be a flaw. So it's the interplay of particular character traits and the way in which a character allows those traits to govern their actions that ultimately make those traits a fatal flaw, a hamartia. Okay, so when we think about the characters in the play, we might be able to attribute ambition to a number of different characters. I mean, Macbeth certainly is ambitious. Lady Macbeth is certainly ambitious. Banquo even feels a little ambitious when he hears that he could be the father of kings. Malcolm is almost certainly ambitious. He's probably led his entire life preparing for the throne. So the reality is lots of characters could have ambition as a character trait without it becoming a fatal flaw. But if we were also to look at something like Macbeth's insecurities, his desire to always have the prize of action without necessarily dealing with any of the consequences or the what ifs, ambition and insecurity will ultimately lead Macbeth to making some really questionable decisions. Okay, so hamartia is the fatal flaw of a character. Most characters, well, lots of characters in tragedies have them. Recognizing the impact of a character's fatal flaw on other characters and on the story as a whole is absolutely central to your analytical process, okay? So then the other one is a foil. Now, drama students will probably be familiar with a foil, but essentially it is a character who contrasts another character. And normally, if the protagonist is the main character, then the character so the protagonist is the one who's going to have a foil. And the whole point is juxtaposition. Okay, so juxtaposition. The whole point is that the two characters are so opposed that the actual contrast helps to highlight what is ideal and what is not ideal. Okay, or what we should want to follow and what we should not want to follow. And potentially there is, as the definition says there, a subplot that could be used as a foil to the main plot. So, and that is certainly the case in a number of the tragedies, such as King Lear, which is being studied by the literature students. Okay, so if we consider who operates as a foil to Macbeth, well, because of his actions, there are probably a couple of different characters who have to fulfill that role because he's pretty good at doing away with anybody who highlights his failings as a king. I mean, we murder King Duncan in the first place, who is entirely chivalrous. He is exactly what we expected of a king, perhaps with the exception of the fact that he's entirely too trusting. we would then go, oh, well, obviously the best of the characters is Banquo. He hears the exact same information as Macbeth and chooses not to act on it. He is a soldier and is able to stay a good and loyal soldier, despite the fact that he's not immediately rewarded with a couple of different titles. And of course, we know that Banquo also meets that sticky end. And so ultimately, if the country is being led by this madman who is going to destroy Scotland as we know it, then the character who stands in opposition to him and who ultimately resolves the story or helps to restore the order is going to be his foil. Okay, so recognizing when we introduce a foil, recognizing the impact of a foil on the protagonist's decision-making. Like, does it make him angry? Does it make him rush? Does it make him arrogant? Is all part of your analytical process. Now, the last three terms there on the slide are not new to you, but they're absolutely central to why we're doing all of this. So I mentioned that characterization is that focus on the deliberate choices made by the author to achieve these outcomes. So when we look at values, attitudes, and beliefs, what we're seeing in characterization is Shakespeare deliberately manipulating the values, attitudes, and beliefs that dominate his life and presenting them in human form in his plays. Okay, so by highlighting something like the great chain of being and seeing that great chain of being destroyed by the actions of a king who should never have been king, we actually reinforce that the great chain of being should always be preserved. So there's a set of values that we see played out in the text and which we can say are being foregrounded for us by Shakespeare. If we ultimately present Lady Macbeth as a fiend-like queen, so someone who is barely human, who is ultimately evil in nature, who certainly cannot be a good Christian, then we are actually suggesting that A, women should behave a certain way, B, Christians should behave a certain way, 3, humans should behave a certain way, and as a result, we can identify what values are actually being held up as ideal in the case of women, Christians, human. Now, when we put values, attitudes, and beliefs together, we end up with cultural assumptions. So these are the assumption is something that we've come to accept. We live in the world of the values, attitudes, and beliefs that are just around us all the time. And cultural assumptions could help you cast the witches as Catholic, because they would be persecuted by the monarchy at the time, being that the monarchy was not Catholic. They would have existed outside of society. They would have had to practice their religion in secret. And if you really want to demonize the church, then you actually recognize their practices as perhaps supernatural. And certainly you could make an argument that because of the treatment of Catholics during the reign of James I, that there is an assumption that the witches could be Catholic. Finally, author's purpose. Right. Never let go of that idea. If you can, write author's purpose, question mark, author's purpose, question mark, at the start of every act. What is it that you think the author is trying to achieve in this part of the story? If you can do that, what you're going to recognize is that the author is really trying to get you to see that consequences have actions, right? That some characters will take action but can't live with the consequences. Others fear the consequences beforehand but ultimately become desensitized to it, so that actually, you know, there are no consequences. They don't care what the consequences are. And the author, if you continually mention that the author positions the audience to see, or the author's purpose in creating the character is, you will be reinforcing your values, attitudes, and beliefs, recognizing the characters as constructions, and ultimately continuing to emphasize that the play is indeed a lesson to readers. Okay, so that's it for this little tutorial. In my very next little tutorial, we're going to focus on thematic interplay. Okay, so thematic analysis, but I want you perhaps to prepare by thinking about the idea of interplay, and that is the way in which ideas come together. Until next time, see you later.